I am 62 years old. I am standing in a driveway that no longer belongs to me. The gravel under my sensible shoes feels like broken glass. The sky over Greenwich, Connecticut, is the color of an old bruise, purple, gray, and heavy with the threat of rain. Behind me stands the Sterling estate. A 30-room Georgian colonial with ivy that has climbed the brick for a century. For 40 years, I was the heart of this house. I polished the mahogany banisters until they glowed like amber. I hosted the fundraisers where senators whispered about policy over my crab cakes.
Before we begin this intriguing story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video, so you don't miss more powerful and emotional life stories like this one. Enjoy the story.
I was Martha Sterling, the wife of Arthur Sterling, the man who turned a small shipping company into a global logistics empire. But 3 weeks ago, Arthur died. He didn't die at home, surrounded by family. He died in the back of a black town car on his way to a private meeting. He died clutching a leather briefcase that contained the final signatures to erase me from his life. The funeral was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. Men in charcoal suits patted my shoulder and spoke about Arthur's integrity. Women who had envied my life for decades wiped away dry eyes. But as soon as the dirt hit the casket, the mask slipped. The lawyers called me into the library, the room that always smelled of Arthur's expensive pipe tobacco and old leather. "Mrs. Sterling," the lead attorney said, not even looking me in the eye. "We've reviewed the updated estate plan. It was amended 6 months ago." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. Amended? Arthur moved the entirety of his liquid assets, the real estate holdings, and the various shell corporations into a private, irrevocable blind trust. I looked at the mahogany desk where I used to pay the household bills. "And the beneficiary?" I asked. The lawyer finally looked up. His eyes were like 2 cold coins. "Not you, Martha. The trust is dedicated to a specific care and maintenance fund for a property in Maine. Everything else has been liquidated to satisfy outstanding personal debts Arthur claims to owe." Personal debts to whom? He didn't specify. But the prenuptial agreement you signed in 1986 is quite clear. In the event of his death, if the estate is insolvent, the spouse receives a lump sum of $50,000 and is required to vacate the primary residence within 21 days. $50,000. In Greenwich, that wouldn't cover the property taxes for a month. 40 years of my life, my youth, my energy, my loyalty, had been appraised at the price of a mid-sized sedan. I was left with a suitcase, a small box of jewelry that Arthur hadn't managed to pawn, and the crushing realization that I had spent my life sleeping next to a stranger. I thought that was the end. I thought the story was just another discarded wife cliché. But then, I went to the attic to pack. The attic was a graveyard of memories. Old trunks filled with baby clothes from children we never had. Boxes of holiday decorations that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. I sat on a dusty stool, feeling the weight of the silence. And then I saw it. Arthur's old grandfather clock, the one his father brought over from London. The pendulum had stopped years ago. It sat in the corner like a wooden skeleton. I don't know why I moved toward it. Maybe I wanted to touch something that felt solid. As I brushed the dust from the casing, I noticed the battery compartment in the back, a modern addition Arthur had installed to keep the chimes running electronically. I opened it. The batteries were long dead, corroded and white. But tucked behind the wires was a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a heavy, iron key. Old-fashioned. Ornate. And a slip of yellowed paper with a set of GPS coordinates and a single sentence written in Arthur's sharp, aggressive handwriting. "The true ledger is kept where the trees hide the sun." I didn't tell the lawyers. I didn't tell my friends. I loaded my few remaining boxes into my 10-year-old SUV and drove north. I drove past the manicured lawns of Connecticut. Past the tourist traps of Massachusetts. Into the deep, jagged heart of Maine. The coordinates led me off the highway. Then off the paved roads. Then onto a gravel path that felt like it was leading me into the mouth of the wilderness. The pines grew so thick they formed a canopy that turned midday into twilight. The air grew cold. It smelled of damp earth and ancient salt. Finally, the path ended at a wall of rusted iron. A gate. It was covered in vines so thick they looked like muscle. I got out of the car. My knees popped from the long drive. I looked at the gate. There was a lock. My hand shook as I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It fit perfectly. The metal groaned, a long, high-pitched scream of neglected hinges, as I pushed the gate open. And there it was. The House of Secrets. It was a Victorian mansion, but it felt wrong. It was built of dark stone, with narrow windows that looked like squinting eyes. It sat on a cliff overlooking a churning, gray Atlantic. There was no garden. No flowers. Just jagged rocks and the sound of waves hitting the shore like a hammer. It wasn't on any map. It didn't exist in the county records. I walked up the stone steps. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around. To go back to my $50,000 and my quiet poverty. But I had spent 40 years being quiet. I pushed the front door. It wasn't even locked. The foyer was vast and freezing. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that swirled like a miniature blizzard. The furniture was covered in white sheets. It looked like a room full of ghosts. But as I moved deeper into the house, I realized it wasn't a home. It was an archive. I entered the grand salon. Instead of paintings of landscapes or ancestors, the walls were covered in photographs. I walked closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I gasped. Every single photo was of me. But they weren't the photos in our family albums. These were taken from a distance. Me at 22, sitting in a park in Brooklyn. Me at 30, shopping for groceries in a store I didn't recognize. Me at 45, crying at my mother's funeral. There were photos of me through windows. Photos of me sleeping. Photos of me from angles that were impossible unless the photographer was hiding in the walls. Arthur hadn't just been my husband. He had been my jailer. He had been a silent observer of a life I thought was private. I felt a wave of nausea. 40 years of "I love you, Martha" had been spoken by a man who was documenting me like a laboratory animal. I followed the trail of photos into the library. On the desk, a carbon copy of the one in Greenwich, sat a single, leather-bound journal. I opened it to the first page. The date was June 14, 1985. The day I met Arthur Sterling at a gala in Manhattan. The target is secured, the entry read. She is perfect. Compliant. Lonely enough to believe in a hero. She has no idea she was chosen months ago. The debt is high, but the prize is higher. I couldn't breathe. Target? Chosen? I flipped through the pages. The journal wasn't a diary. It was a report. Arthur had been paid. He hadn't been a self-made man. He had been an employee. A man named the benefactor had funded Arthur's entire life. The shipping company. The mansion in Greenwich. The clothes. The cars. All of it was a front. And the condition for the funding? He had to marry me. He had to keep me in a state of controlled contentment. And he had to keep me away from the other one. I sat in the dark library, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The other one. 40 years ago, before Arthur, there was Julian. Julian was a rebel. A musician with messy hair and a laugh that sounded like freedom. We were engaged. We were going to run away to Paris. But one night, Julian vanished. He left a note, a cold, typed note, saying he didn't love me. That he had found someone else. I was broken. I was a shell. And Arthur was there to pick up the pieces. He was the hero who saved me from my heartbreak. I flipped to the end of the journal. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. The term is ending. Martha is getting older. The benefactor is dead. My contract is void. I've moved the money. I won't let her have a cent of the blood money. If she finds this house, let her find the truth. Let her see what a simple life actually costs. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. There was a noise. A soft, rhythmic thump hiss. Thump hiss. It was coming from the floor above. I climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under my weight. I followed the sound to the end of a long, dark corridor. I pushed open the door to a master bedroom. The room was filled with medical equipment. Oxygen tanks. Heart monitors. And a nurse. A woman in her 60s, wearing a gray uniform. She was sitting in a chair, knitting. She looked up at me. Her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was one of profound relief. "You're late, Martha," she said. "Who are you?" I whispered. "What is this?" "I'm Eleanor. I've been on the payroll for 38 years. Arthur told me that when he died, the money for my salary would stop, and you would eventually find the key." She stood up and pointed to the bed. A man lay there. His hair was white. His skin was like translucent parchment. He was connected to a dozen tubes. But his eyes were open. They were a bright, piercing blue. The blue of a musician I once knew in Brooklyn. "Julian," my voice was a broken sob. The man's hand moved. Just a fraction. "He didn't leave you, Martha," Eleanor said. "Arthur didn't just want you. He wanted to win. He couldn't have you as long as Julian existed. So he used the benefactor's money to stage the disappearance. He didn't kill him, that would be too simple for a man like Arthur." She walked over to the bed and touched Julian's brow. "He kept him here. In a pharmacological fog for decades. He wanted Julian to watch you through the monitors. He wanted Julian to see you being happy with the man who stole your life." I walked to the bed. My heart didn't just break, it disintegrated. Julian looked at me. A single tear rolled down his temple. He had been here. For 40 years. While I was playing perfect wife in Greenwich. While I was laughing at Arthur's jokes. While I was sleeping in the bed of the man who had kidnapped my soul. Julian had been in this dark house, listening to the waves, watching me through a screen. "The money," I said, my voice turning into something cold and razor-sharp. "The trust Arthur left. The one for care and maintenance." Eleanor nodded. "It's millions, Martha. Arthur was a monster, but he was a meticulous one. He ensured Julian would be kept alive as long as possible. The trust pays for the medical staff, the house, the taxes, and the guardian." I looked at the black card Eleanor held out to me. The key to the sterling fortune. Arthur hadn't left me bankrupt to punish me. He had left me bankrupt to force me here. He knew that if I was poor, I would have no choice but to take the only job left to me. Becoming the caretaker for a man who could no longer speak. In a house that was a monument to my own destruction. I looked at Julian. I took his hand. It was thin and cold, but it was his. "We're going to Paris, Julian," I whispered. His monitors spiked. A soft, wheezing sound came from his throat. "Not today," I said, looking at Eleanor. "But soon." I looked at the cameras in the corners of the room. I knew Arthur was dead. But I felt his eyes on me. I walked over to the monitor system on the desk. I saw the screen showing the foyer. The library. The hallway. And then I saw the button. Delete all archives. I pressed it. The screens went black. The 40-year movie of my life was gone. I turned back to the window. The rain had finally started. It washed against the glass, blurring the world outside. I am 62 years old. I have millions of dollars. I have the man I loved. And I have a house that no one knows exists. Arthur thought he had the final word. He thought he had trapped me in a cage of guilt and duty. But he forgot one thing. I learned how to be a sterling from him. I learned how to be cold. I learned how to calculate. And I learned how to move assets in the dark. I looked at the iron key on the nightstand. I wasn't the Queen of Greenwich anymore. I was the master of the shadows. And before I died, I would make sure the world forgot Arthur Sterling ever existed. Sometimes, being left with nothing is the only way to realize you are finally free to take everything.